I just met Katherine a few minutes ago, but I felt like I knew her already because I had just read this wonderful book, The Daughters of Temperance Hobbs, which just came out, right?
June.
In June, yeah, that's what I thought. So she's sort of at the tail end of the dog and pony show on the road thing.
Which is good because I can't bend over anymore.
You can see she's great with child, so yeah.
Gravid.
So I'm going to start by, I hope not butchering, but just giving you a sense of what the book is about. So it's called a historical novel, but really the vast majority of it takes place in contemporary, the year 2000.
It's history now.
It is history now, I suppose, but not the same as the 1600s, which is where we also go to. So we have Connie, who is an academic. Her specialty is early American colonial history. She's on a kind of ferocious tenure track journey at a university in Boston. And her kind of, not subspecialty, but special interest is witchcraft and the era of the Salem witch trials, and also what happened to the crime of witchcraft after that horrible era. And then there's Sam, who's her lovey-dove, and she has found herself quite unexpectedly pregnant and thinking they're going to now get married. But there's another character, Grace, who's Connie's mom, and she is, I started to think of her, and I don't know if you intended it, but as kind of a modern version of a witch. She's very new age, all crystals and potions and, star catchers and all that, whatever you call those things.
Dream catchers.
So Grace, when she discovers Connie's pregnancy, tells her that she is going to have to ditch Sam because there is a lineage, a female lineage in their family that dates back to Salem, and there is some kind of a curse, and the husband of all of these women throughout this lineage, as soon as there was procreation involved, something devastating happened to the man. And Grace really likes Sam and doesn't want to see him die. So there's kind of a race to find an antidote to this curse, and there's codes that need to be cracked, etc. But there's also, at the same time, this kind of dark academic skullduggery going on in Connie's department and in the world, the academic world that she moves in, which also has its own demons.
Totally fictional. Skullduggery and competition never happens in academia.
I'm going to ask you about that. But then the other thing that happens is these short interludes where we go back to the 1600s and the secrets that Connie in the present is trying to find out, we can see playing out in these brief flash waybacks to the 1600s and a little beyond with the women who are her ancestors. And so sometimes the reader knows a little bit more than Connie does about the journey she's on to find the keys to all these secrets. So have I totally,
that's great.
Accurate enough?
I have to say, you guys may not know this, it's actually really hard to summarize your own novel. And I feel like as someone who writes magical, realist, historical fiction, whenever someone asks me what I write about, I always feel like a little kid being like, so, like, pretend like witches are real, but not like really real, but like differently real, and not with pointy hats, and so it's always kind of exciting to hear what someone else would say.
Well, I'm glad that I decided to summarize. That's good. Now, this is also, I have not read the first book, but there was an earlier book called The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane.
Mouthful.
Yes. And it also mines the same territory. Connie is the same character, like 9 years earlier, I guess. And there are references to the earlier story, but I was telling Katherine that as a first-timer here, it didn't make a bit of difference. The story is a complete universe in itself in this book, but it did make me want to go back and read the first book.
Strictly speaking, this is a standalone follow-up.
Yeah, there you go. I like that, a standalone follow-up. But my question about it is, I was once asked by an editor, and not ironically, to write the same book again with all different words.
Wow.
So my question is, did you just feel Obviously, I said no. But did you feel as if...
But an interesting creative challenge, though. You could just do synonyms for everything.
Yeah, I know. Synonym for the. Start with that. But anyway, I wondered if you were just not quite finished with these characters, or was this something that your publisher asked you to do because the first one did very well?
So the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane was my very first novel, and it has virtually all the same characters as this book, except it's set in 1991 and in 1692. And at that time, Connie is a graduate student, and she discovers that one of the Salem witches was the real thing, but the real thing, the way the colonists believed witches to be, not the sort of fantastical Harry Potter sense. And so that story is very much about Connie coming into herself. Like, in our 20s, we all go through this moment where we stop defining ourselves by our family, by our friends, and we start to figure out who we really are as individual people. But that's also a very inwardly oriented process. And so there was an aspect of that story that I wanted to continue exploring. There were historical women in Connie's family that I wanted to think about. Temperance Hobbs, obviously, is the primary one in this story. And also, I was interested to think about Connie at a different moment in her life, because 10 years later, so the novel has come out 10 years after the first novel. Connie's life has gone 10 years later. My life has gone 10 years later. Connie and I keep kind of weaving around each other in ways that are a little bit creepy, which we can talk about if you want. And so Connie is now in her mid-30s. She's at a transition point in her career. She's at a transition point in her personal life, in her family life. She's entering that stage of life where she's starting to look outward from herself and starting to figure out who she is relative to her community. So we see Connie discovering what it's like to be a mentor. We see Connie starting to realize that she's going to have to pay more attention to her mother as her mother is aging. And of course, the biggest change is that Connie is about to become a mother herself, which is not something she'd planned. It's like getting in the way of her professional career. And so now she has to make some decisions about her professional life and what her priorities are going to look like. And so I was interested in going further into Connie's stages. And maybe that's because I myself am 10 years older. You know, Connie and I are on the same path, roughly. And so it was a story that I really wanted to tell. It was cool that the publisher gave me the opportunity to do it. And I've really enjoyed everything about it.
What about you as a writer 10 years later? I mean, do you think that you could have written this version of the book a couple of months after you did the first one?
That's a good question, and it's hard to answer, because this is my 6th book. So Physic Book was my first, and that was for adults. My second was called The House of Velvet and Glass. It's also a historical fiction, magical realist, set in Boston, but in a totally different time period. Then I have 2 young adult books, which are a little bit different, but also a bit witchy. And then one nonfiction book called The Penguin Book of Witches. So there's a theme. Yes. Noticed a theme. And so certainly I think my writing style has perhaps changed. It would be hard for me to pinpoint how.
It would. So you couldn't look at this and say, well, I wouldn't have structured it, wouldn't have known to structure it this way. Oh, thank you, Louis. They're perfect. Thank you, yes.
But I did, when planning this book, I went back to the outline I made for the very first book. And so if you know the first book, there are certain story beats that echo each other over the course of the story. And in fact, the first chapter in this book is like an almost straightforward recapitulation in like deja vu form of the first chapter of the first book. And it's partly Connie's in a different role from the one she was in the first chapter of the first book. And it's one of those things where she sort of wakes up and is like, oh my gosh, I've been here before, but now I'm a totally different person. Yeah.
So. Did I hear that right, that you outline?
Yes.
Oh, you're one of those. I'm so jealous.
No, people are so disappointed all the time because I think there's a fantasy that we write with quill pens, and much of my time is spent staring out of windows and being romantic, and the truth is I use Excel.
Wow. I'm trying to do that right now. I'm kind of working on something very early stage, and I'm thinking I'm just not doing it the same way again. I'm going to just plan out what's going to happen, and I just am not that writer.
You don't have to be that writer.
But it would save me so much time, I
One
think.
of my good friends is Julia Glass, who has won the National Book Award and who's also amazing and likes to drink wine on my porch. And this is what writers do in our off hours.
This is all we ever do.
And Julia's a pantser, and she is one of these people, if you haven't encountered her books, her best-known one is called 3 Junes. And she writes these very nuanced, personal, character-driven family stories, and she just writes her way into them. And as a result, she kind of has flashbacks within flashbacks within flashbacks, and they're so textured and so nuanced, and I have no idea how she does it, because I couldn't keep it all in my head.
Yeah.
So there's no right way to do it.
There isn't. I know we all have our ways, but you always think somebody else's way will save you time. I would like you, I have another question, but first I want you to read something for me.
It's exciting because she has not told me what she's planning.
Right there, up to there, just that little.
Okay.
And I should say that Connie is thinking about leaving the job she has now, which her tenure track, for this kind of plum job at Harvard. And this is just a little passage about that.
Connie went to Harvard for graduate school in history, and she is now a professor at Northeastern, and she's up for tenure, which is a really stressful, heinous moment in an academic's life. What would it feel like to profess at Harvard? Sometimes there was a special brutality to working at the institution where one had also studied. Colleagues remembered you before your ideas were cooked through. The wormy underbelly of institutional politics, kept so carefully hidden from students and alumni, was an unavoidable part of a job in the professoriate. Nothing would burn away Connie's nostalgia faster than her first faculty meeting. And then there was the fact that no one, ever got tenure at Harvard unless they came in with it. And sometimes, not even then. Connie could apply, but if she actually got Chilton's job, it might, paradoxically, ruin her career.
One line that really just made my bones shiver, because I have not spent much time in academia.
Good.
So much
Don't.
academic rhetoric was about domination and control. So I have 2 questions about that. One is that this line, so much about academic rhetoric was about domination and control, that felt to me very thematic to the book, because the witches and all of it's people trying to assert some autonomy when they don't have any. Absolutely. And there was something about those poor women doing that, and I see this poor woman in contemporary time trying to assert some autonomy in a world that's very dark. This view of academia is pretty ferocious and dark, and so my question, I wondered if you share her view of that, and whether you yourself, it seems like you have spent some time in that world.
I started writing fiction while I was in a doctoral program at Boston University. And I am married to an academic, so I am tangential to academia and spent a lot of time in it. But you're right that one of the things that interests me about witchcraft and the history of witchcraft, and also folklore in general, is that it is essentially about power. It is about the desire for power over uncontrollable circumstances. It's a kind of power that is often claimed by subaltern people, people who don't have power in sort of mainstream society. So for instance, there's a tension in physics book between alchemical knowledge and witchcraft knowledge. Alchemical was like the university knowledge of the early modern period, and witchcraft knowledge was the folk knowledge. And so I'm interested in how the deployment of knowledge becomes a rhetoric for control. And I'm also interested in the ways that our understanding of what is true changes over time. So, for instance, in my second novel, The House of Velvet and Glass, one of the themes in it has to do with spiritualism. Did you know that in the 19-teens, one of the major areas of inquiry in Harvard's nascent psychology department was the scientific proof of the existence of the human soul? Wow. Yes. William James, founder of American pragmatism, fully believed that we were on the brink of being able to scientifically prove the human soul existed. Wow is right, because now we hear that and we're like, are you crazy? But I mean, that was the sort of vector of empowered knowledge and inquiry at that moment in time. So I'm interested in the ways that knowledge and power are constituted within given historical moments. I'm deep in the weeds, you guys. You can tell I was in grad school. I'm sorry.
That was great. She's wicked smart. I have a question. I saw something on your bio that your own lineage goes back to, that you are related to two of the Salem witches, one who survived, three?
Two who survived and one who did not. Yeah. That's correct.
Did you come by that knowledge from your mother the way Connie did, or did you research it? How did you find this out?
That's a great question. So the North Shore of Massachusetts in general, is a little bit unusual in its settlement in the early part of the colonies, that people showed up and a lot of times didn't really leave, and they didn't really marry outside of that group. So New York City, for instance, is very different. I've been doing, for different projects, some research on colonial New York City, and Dutch settlers in New York married people from the South, they married people from all over the place, so there was a lot of admixture. Massachusetts, not so much. So our family showed up pretty early, and then we just sat around, and I'm my own sixth cousin a couple times over. Let's not think about it too hard. But that's just one of these sort of quirks of this pattern of settlement. So I found out about two of the witches when I was a teenager, because my aunt had done some genealogical research. And one was not a surprise. Howe is my name, it's not my married name. And Elizabeth Howe was one of the witches who was put to death towards the beginning of the Salem Panic. She, it turns out, is unsurprisingly, she's like an 8th or 9th great aunt. And she was kind of a weirdo. She had put herself up for full church membership in Topsfield, Mass., but she had been denied it. We can talk about why that's important if you want to, but we don't have to. So she was one of them. The other one was Elizabeth Proctor, who was supposed to be put to death, but was, there's another theme, pregnant. So they were going to wait until she had delivered the baby before they put her to death. And by the time, fortunately for her, by the time that happened, they'd already dispatched her husband, John, but the contours of the trials had changed a bit, and so she ended up escaping with her life, and she went on and remarried again later. And the third one was really kind of mind-blowing. This will sound like an endorsement. I don't mean it as an endorsement. A couple years ago, I was just poking around on Ancestry. So many records have been digitized now. It's really remarkably easy. When my aunt did it, it was really hard. So I'm hanging out years ago after Physic Book has come out. Physic Book is called the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane. Okay, Deliverance Dane is a name. So I'm point, click, hanging out on Ancestry, filling in some branch that my aunt hadn't done, and I'm like, da-da-da-da-da. And I come across an Anna Dane, and I'm like, that's a crazy coincidence. How about that? Point, click. Nathaniel Dane. Point, click. Deliverance Dane is my 8th great-grandmother. She's even more closely related. She was, the real Deliverance Dane was a very minor person in the Salem Panic. She was accused right near the end. Her life was not really in danger. She was in prison for a very short period of time. One of the reasons I picked her was because she was pretty obscure, so there was room for me to tell a fantastical, magical story around her without upsetting any preconceived notions we might have about her. And also because her name is so metal, right? Deliverance Dane is the most Puritan name ever. Yeah. So I loved it. And so she is more closely related to me than the woman with the same last name as me.
Oh, that is amazing. What an amazing story.
Oh yeah, it
kind
flipped
of
me
makes you
out.
Wonder if witchcraft at work, in your
one of the most sort of best-known historians of witchcraft is a woman named Mary Beth Norton, who just retired from Cornell, and she wrote an amazing nonfiction book about Salem I can tell you about. You should read if you're interested. And she says that the longer anyone works on witchcraft, the more superstitious you become, and that has absolutely been my experience.
I have a question that's kind of about novel writing in the technological age. So I just read another novel last week, big thick book by Ethan Kanan about a mathematical genius, and he chose to set it in the 70s, and then it doesn't go any farther than like maybe 1995. In other words, early computer stuff, not the big stuff. And I also noticed that in this book, and this, not just this book, and several books I've read lately, they're all set like just when we all have these things in our hands 24 hours a day.
Tricorders.
And I'm wondering if you did that as I feel like plot is easier when all the characters don't have access to instant answers every second of their lives. Absolutely. And not instant communication, all of this stuff. Like, part of the part that's so interesting about this, and actually there was something I did want to read, and it was a passage I really liked. Connie is looking up for the physics book online, not online, but on a microfilm machine in this dusty corner of the library. And I just really liked being there with her in that. And this is a paragraph that, you couldn't have written if you'd said it even 6 or 7 years later. So could you just read that little paragraph right there? It's very atmospheric.
So Connie is in the basement of Schlesinger Library, which is the library at Radcliffe, which is a real place and which has a specialty in the history of women, and specifically a very famous collection of cookbooks. And she's done some research there before. The room was empty and silent, save for the occasional rumble in the heating ducts overhead. A thin film of dust coated the top of the microfilm reader, flecked with chips of paint from the ductwork. Connie pursed her lips and blew a puff of air at the dust, the paint flecks ticking softly onto the desk next to her. There was no silence like the silence of passing away technology in the corner of the library.
Isn't that lovely? And I thought that's something that, you couldn't have if this, she'd be Googling it. And so I'm just wondering if you share I haven't really thought it through yet, but that just the way Google has become the wet blanket at a dinner party, when you used to go like an hour and a half thinking, oh, wait, was it 1978 or 18, when did that happen, or what was that? And somebody will just say, oh, well, it's this. I just look, on my machine. And I'm thinking, well, there goes
And of course, everything on
pleasant.
Google is true.
Well, that's the other thing, too,
Well,
so, I just think it's harder to do plot. Contemporary time.
I would agree. So the first stage of Connie's story is set in 1991 for 2 reasons. One, because it is actually, so there was a different dating system in place during the Salem Panic. The new year started in March, so on March 25th. So technically, if you ever see dates with a slash, like 1691/92, technically, the Salem Panic began in 1691/92. So I enjoyed that I could have like a secret 400-year symmetry if I put Connie's story in 1991. But the other big reason was because that story, Physic Book, is a story about her going into archives. It's it's a quest. It's a quest, and she had to go to libraries, and she had to dig into the archives, and she had to find people had to stand in her way. In fact, I offended some librarians because I had a couple of minor characters who were not helpful librarians, and librarians were like, all we want to do is help. And I was like, I know, but I can't just have her show up and have the librarian be like, here's the book you want. I managed to correct that with Temperance Hobbs, thank goodness. Librarians are wonderful, and I love them. But I needed Connie to be going into the archive. I also needed her to be alone. She had to face, really alone. Do you remember in the 80s and 90s when we could be unfindable and alone? Yes. And that's both exciting and also scary, if you're a woman, perhaps? So it was easy for me to set this part of Connie's story in 2000. Fortunately, I can remember the technological moment of 2000, and Connie is a little bit of a Luddite. So she, her partner has been hassling her to get a cell phone, and she just won't do it. Surely you guys, I had a cell phone by 2000, but I had plenty of holdout friends who were like, I'm not doing that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no.
So Connie is resistant to having a cell phone. She ends up working with a graduate student who's younger than her, and the graduate student, unsurprisingly, has better command of the technology that is available for research. So Connie is like, oh, I'm going to go to the microfilm. And her grad student is like, but they digitized all the census records. I can just go look at those. And Connie's like, what? How did you do that so fast? And so I would agree. Technology has a way of changing time. It makes us closer together physically. It makes things happen closer together temporally. In one of my YA novels is set amongst some teenagers in, 2012. And I do have texting as part of their, how they communicate, because it would be inauthentic if they didn't communicate that way. But it was a challenge to figure out how to make that technology present in a realistic way that doesn't just, ruin any sense of mystery.
Yeah, it's hard to make texting dramatic.
Right.
And yet,
Yeah.
especially if you're writing with teenage protagonists, that's how they communicate. So
Yeah.
it is a challenge for a writer, I think.
Yeah.
Speaking of YA, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I have this hunch that a lot of books out there that are for young adults, teenage readers, could easily be marketed as an adult book. And sometimes I think that some of the genres that we look for, mystery and science fiction and all of these things, but young adult is one of them, that it's really more of, so much of our publishing lives are driven by marketing. And I'm wondering if you, just as this is more of a business question really now that I think about it, but whether or not you're happy with the designations of some of your books being, mainstream fiction, in other words, for adults, and others being YA, in other words,
Upmarket
for
commercial fiction.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, one of the great, I write YA a little bit differently, but not much. I definitely, certainly, if there's one thing young people hate, and I know this having once been one a while ago, it's being condescended to. So at no point do I write down to anyone. I don't change the vocabulary, and every once in a blue moon you'll see a complaint on my Goodreads reviews. They're like, there were really hard vocabulary words in this book. I'm like, well, I'm sorry. What do you want? So the only difference is that when I write YA, I typically have a narrower range of perspectives for the characters. The characters will be adolescents, late teens usually, early 20s maybe, and kids at that age are pretty into what's going on with themselves. So for instance, in Conversion, my first YA novel, which is a witchy novel, we meet my main character, Colleen's parents. We get a sense of their personalities, but we never find out what they do for a living, because Colleen doesn't care. She's not thinking about it, right? She's thinking about herself and her friends and what's going on with her friends. So I find in so-called adult fiction, I'm actually able to write a broader age range. So I can write older people. I've written perspectives. There's at least one chapter in here from the perspective of a child. And so I feel like in adult fiction, I typically write close third, so that I have a little bit more breadth of what's going on around me, more context. And I write YA in first person because it feels very immediate and very kind of personal. That being said, my second YA book is called The Appearance of Annie Van Sinderen. It's a ghost story set in New York City. My husband teased me and called it the great American abolitionist anarchist ghost novel the world has been waiting for. Incredibly, it didn't sell all that well. I really like that book. But it has very adult themes. It has themes of loss and of nostalgia and of longing, and not that teens don't experience all of these things, but I think that those themes tend to be a little bit broader, maybe. So in answer to your question, I think that genre constraints can enable us to do things, but they also can sometimes silo us a little bit. So I've been surprised to hear from some people who enjoyed my adult books who didn't pick up my YA books because they thought they wouldn't get anything out of them, even though most readers of young adult are actually adults. And so that is...
Adults defined as 21 or over?
I mean,
but do you mean like old grown-ups?
Yeah.
Those are the biggest readers of
Those are
young
the
adult.
biggest buyers and readers and reviewers and bloggers about young adult fiction. And it's interesting because...
That's very surprising. I did not know that.
Well, it is, but it also isn't, because there's such a, that moment in life is so intense, it's so exciting. We all remember that moment. We all, barely survived it, I feel like. And I think that there's a certain hunger for that intensity. I think that there's a sensation or feeling of being able to dip back into it. One thing I will say that I really enjoyed about writing YA is that, from a marketing perspective, I got to visit schools. I got to go talk to teenagers, actual teenagers. So, the way that we travel around is often kind of controlled by the publisher. So as much as I love bookstores and libraries and historical societies, which is what I usually do, it was pretty cool to be able to go and address high school students. I mean, sometimes it was challenging.
They probably say things to you that you're not quite ready for?
Sometimes, but every once in a while, the biggest challenge was I did somebody's high school assembly, and it was like the
that's just
whole
cruel.
school. It was the whole school. It was at the end of the school day. And all the teachers clearly were like, this means we can check out. And so it was
just
chaos.
cruel.
And fortunately, I had taught college freshmen enough so I could be like, I need your attention. I need your attention. If you're listening, raise your hand. And oh my God, it was like deeply buried skill sets.
Never again. Never again. Oh my gosh. There were other things historically in this that really caught me, because I don't really know much about this era, so I feel like I learned a lot by reading it. And there's a wonderful afterword by the author, just talking about your sources and also some theories that you have. And I wonder if you would talk just a little bit, because I did not know any of this, about the summer that wasn't, and your theory about what possibly could have been behind it.
So I typically write in a couple timelines, but we've been talking about the year 2000 timeline a bit. The historical timeline in Daughters of Temperance Hobbs is set in 1816. And 1816 was the year without a summer. And that was a real phenomenon that happened. It was particularly acute in Europe and on the east coast of North America. And summer never came. There were deep freezes in May. It wreaked havoc on agriculture. And now historians tend to think that it was caused by a volcanic eruption, that it was just like a weird weather anomaly that happened on the other side of the world that had these far-reaching consequences. But what's interesting is that the year without a summer, because it was so economically devastating, arguably it is one of the factors that caused a population shift from coastal communities in New England, like where we are, into the interior. Because the year after this, 1817, is when construction begins on the Erie Canal, which I know because I wrote the great American abolitionist anarchist ghost novel the world's been waiting for, which was set in 1825. So the Erie Canal started being constructed in 1817, and of course, for the first decade or two of the 19th century, the canal system was the major artery of movement into the interior, into what was then the frontier, New York State, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania. So of course there were many other reasons for why there might be a population shift that way, but the year without a summer is part of it. And of course we're living through a moment where we are grappling with really profound changes in our climate and what that's going to mean for coastal communities, what it's going to mean for population shifts. There's been talk in the news about climate refugees. And in effect, the first wave of Western expansion in American society was climate refugees. And so I was interested in thinking a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. I think I had heard the term, but I didn't really know when or how or what. And you have kind of a cheeky little wondering, because in these spell books or what, I don't know, potions.
I end up blaming it not on a volcano. How about that?
Yeah, but it's
I hold individuals responsible who probably shouldn't be held responsible.
There were a lot of weather potions, let me just say that.
Don't give too much away.
I won't, but it factors in, let me just say, yeah. So what is on your reading list right now? I mean, do you read a lot of history, or do you read contemporary fiction? Because, I mean, this is contemporary fiction in a sense.
Well, I'm a history nerd, so I actually, and this is sometimes disappointing to people, I read a lot of history. I read a lot of history books. I read a lot of secondary sources. I read a lot of primary sources. I'm excited to dig into a book that is about the history of science in the Gulf Coast in the 18th and 19th centuries, which I think maybe I'm the only one in this room excited about it, but I'm really excited to read that book.
I'm sure you can make it exciting.
I've been reading a lot about New York, sort of prominent Gilded Age families in New York for a different project that I'm working on. And so I'm mostly a history reader. Yeah. And it's true because when writing fiction, I don't know if this is you guys' experience, but I'm very absorbent. I can't really read other people's fiction while I'm drafting my own, because I feel like I need to have that. I construct this universe in my head and I carry it around with me wherever I go, and I feel like I can't afford to let someone else's universe blend into it. So I don't read other fiction while I am drafting, and I'm drafting a lot.
Yeah.
So what about you? What are you reading right now?
I just finished that book I was mentioning, which is a big, thick one by Ethan Kanan called A Doubter's Almanac, about this math genius, and there's so much math in it. This guy, he's either a math genius himself, which I think he isn't. I mean, but it didn't matter that you didn't understand proofs and all of this business, because it's really about the mind behind all of this. And I've also been kind of into short stories again lately. Nice. I don't really know why. I used to love them, and then I kind of just fell off the short story train for a while, and now I'm back on it, which is very satisfying. But I'm not like you, though. I actually find a lot of inspiration in reading writers I love while I'm working on fiction. I think when I was, maybe writing my first novel, I think maybe I didn't do that, but I thought, oh, I don't want to be influenced, but I just draw a lot of solace and thinking, okay, it can be done. I know it can be done. So I do tend to read a lot of fiction when I'm writing fiction. I read a lot of plays when I'm writing plays. I just find it inspiring.
I'm always worried that I'm going to pick up something and not realize that I've picked it up.
Oh, wouldn't that be awful?
It would be awful. Like
it probably happens all the time.
Yeah, when Physic Book came out, it was so interesting. So there's kind of a creepy cottage at the center of this story, and it's at the center of Physic Book as well. And it's, it kind of plays on the like witchy cottage trope that we all remember from Grimm's fairy tales. And I have a lot of fun with it. Like, you can't see the house unless you look at it in just the right way. I find it really fun. But it was very interesting to me, like, when the first book came out, someone reached out to me and said, it's so obvious how influenced you are by the House of the Seven Gables. It's amazing. And I'm like, what? But then I went back and read The House of the Seven Gables, which I hadn't read probably since high school. Yeah. It's a Nathaniel Hawthorne book. And of course I'm influenced by The House of the Seven Gables. No idea. So,
I would not have wanted to hear that.
It's okay. Also, like, Nathaniel
Don't
Hawthorne.
ever tell an author, oh, this is just like something else.
I was okay with it because Nathaniel Hawthorne was so catty about women novelists. I was, like, totally fine with it. He referred to us as those damned scribbling women.
He was the one who
That
first
was
said
him.
that?
Jerk. Yeah. Nat.
Wow, I didn't know he was the one who first said that. I knew it was one of those guys.
He also, in The House of the Seven Gables, stole a line from a real Salem witch. And he put it in. So Sarah Good, one of the first people who's accused at Salem and who was one of the first people put to death, who was destitute and poor and who was imprisoned and lost a baby while she was in prison. Like, she had it bad. And she is up on the gallows, and she says, I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink. Yeah, how badass is that? I wouldn't have that kind of...
That is badass.
Like, that's so tough. And Nathaniel Hawthorne takes that line away from Sarah Good, puts it in the mouth of Matthew Mall, a dude, of course.
Wow. Sure. Yeah.
So I'm okay with interfering with Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Steal away. This might be a good time to open up for questions. So if people in the audience have any questions for Katherine or me or both of us, please feel free. Oh, and Louis is going to do the microphone thing.
My standard joke on this book tour so far has been, here's this book I wrote. Please buy it. I will now field questions about the baby. He's a boy. And because it's very important to have a child who's on brand, he's due at the end of October.
Oh, I really hope he's born on Halloween.
Wouldn't that be something?
That would be great for your brand, yes.
I figure I can make it if I have a positive attitude and do enough yoga.
Questions? Yeah, great.
There's one.
How do you account for the fact that women's magic survived religious persecution in the 16th, 17th centuries, got to America, but has not really survived much to today? Have you tried to follow what the cause of that would have been?
That's an interesting question, but I think I'm going to push back on it ever so slightly. And that is that, so folk magic belief, it was slightly gendered in the early modern period, but not entirely, and it was very widespread. And in fact, it was one of the signal achievements, arguably, of Catholicism was the way that doctrinaire Catholicism could kind of take in folk magic belief and practice and legitimate it in interesting ways. Protestantism wasn't as good at doing that. So I can give you some examples of folk magic practices from the early modern period if you're curious to hear some. But it was sort of separate from religious life. Like there was religious life and there was folk life, and they would intersect a bit, but not always. And one of the arguments that this book makes, actually, is that folk magic and belief in it changes in meaning over time. So the anti-witchcraft statute, which was an English law under which Salem and all the other North American witch trials were prosecuted, that's the law that makes witchcraft a felony, just like murder. That's why in North America we hanged witches instead of burning them. Common misconception. It was not an ecclesiastic crime like it was on the continent. It was a government crime. The anti-witchcraft statute changes in 1735 in a way that I find really interesting. It goes from being a felony to practice witchcraft to being a felony to present yourself as if you practice witchcraft, i.e. for money. Now what this tells me is two things. One, witchcraft means something different by the 1730s. It is less scary. It is less of an economic threat than it used to be. And I have a couple theories as to why that is. But the other important thing it tells us is that our belief is intact. We don't need to pass a law protecting ourselves from our belief if our belief isn't still intact. So, for example, there's a great poem by John Greenleaf Whittier about Moll Pitcher. She's kind of fallen out of our American popular history a little bit, but she was called the sole Pythoness of ancient Lynn. She was a real person. She was born in the 18th century in Marblehead. She sold weather charms. She died in Lynn in 1815. Real person. And like famous, the world, not the world over, but like America over. Famous enough to have poems written about her. So belief continues. And then as we get into the 20th century, by the time we get to the 1930s, there is an English folklorist named Gerald Gardner who kind of makes a syncretic religion out of some of these folk magic beliefs. This is when Wicca is kind of invented. He sort of assembles a religion out of disparate sets of folk magic practices. That happens in the 20th century. That belief system grows in the 1970s because of the women's movement, because of empowerment for the women's movement. So there is modern witchcraft and modern paganism. It's kind of put together, it's kind of invented, but it is a way that codifies long-standing earlier practices. And so I'll give you one other example, which I found really fascinating. So in Physic book, I found an early modern divination method and use it as a plot device. It's called the Sieve and Scissors, and this is like an early Magic 8-ball, where if you have a question you want the answer to, you take a big pair of shears, you open it into a cross shape, you put a colander on top, you ask your question, hold it out like this, and if the colander tips over, the answer is yes, and if it stays in place, the answer is no. This is an actual folk magic practice that I found in assorted records from like the 1600s. Use it as a plot device. Fast forward however many years later, I'm reading a collection for a totally different project of oral histories taken in East Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and other parts of the Gulf Coast by a folklorist traveling around from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And what do I find? In East Texas in 1940, the Sieve and Scissors, unchanged. So, folk belief is actually a very strong thing. And so I give long-winded answers. I hope that's okay. So it just sometimes our language around it changes, or the meaning of it changes. But it still bubbles around. We still have these habits of mind, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Oh, that's fascinating. It really is.
I flipped out when I found it.
Yeah, this has been exciting. Yeah.
That oral history also contains a recipe for how to protect your still from being raided by the feds. I can tell you how to do that if you want to know.
Sounds very interesting. I'd like to know, do you write like in modern English, or is there phases where it gets into the Old English?
Question. One of the things that is really cool about working on 17th century stuff is from that period, there are actually court transcripts that if you read them are like watching an episode of Law and Order. I mean, it's really cool the way that the court, they had court reporters writing down how people spoke. And sometimes you even get variations in spelling because spelling did not become standardized until into the beginning of the 19th century. And so this is why sometimes you'll see the name Howe spelled without an E on the end, for example. Like it doesn't solidify until the first dictionaries show up. But what's cool about that is occasionally with variant spelling, you can kind of see how people spoke. You can kind of hear accents a little bit if you pay attention to it. So I try to use slang and vocal constructions that are historically accurate to the best of my ability, but in a way that's still going to be legible to a modern day reader. So it always drives me a little bit crazy if someone is speaking in the past and either they're speaking like they're on Masterpiece Theatre, as if everyone was more correct in the past and no one used slang and no one was ever drunk. You know? And I'm here to tell you, one thing you learn about American history is in the past, everyone was drunk all the time. So I try to be as authentic to it as I can. I mean, of course, there's you have to make certain allowances, and one of the challenges with writing historical fiction actually is every once in a while there'll be something that is historically correct, that is surprising enough that it would seem like an anachronism. So you can't use it because it might push someone out of the book. So you have to seem trustworthy as well as being trustworthy. It can be a little bit challenging that way.
We have time for one more, and then Monica and Catherine can sign books. Thanks.
So you've been talking about historical, scientific, but when you talk about witchcraft, where does the fairy tale come in?
What a great question. That is a great question. The fairy tale comes in when witchcraft recedes, I would argue, when witchcraft recedes from the legal realm. It starts to become a bit more of a fairy tale. So, like the Grimm fairy tales that we all grew up with, those are German folk tales that were collected in the 19th century. So an interesting thing is happening in the 18th century when our relationship with magic has started to change. So here in North America, for instance, by the time we get to the 1700s, we're having what some historians have called a consumer revolution. And all that means is that average people are just like a bit better off. Like in the 1600s, the average family, your most valuable possession was your bedding. You often didn't have much in the way of cookware. You certainly didn't have any like silver to speak of, anything like that. By the time we get to the 1700s, trade is a little bit easier. There are more imports. Manufacturing has changed. You can get mass-produced Wedgwood, cups and things like that. So like average life has become a little bit easier for most people. And that actually has a lot to do with our changing relationship with witchcraft. So if you look at the kinds of things witches were accused of doing in the 1600s, to our modern ears today, they sound impossibly picayune. So like a witch might be accused of causing someone's butter to not come together, or causing their barrel of beer to go bad. And today you think, well, so? But in the 1600s, if your butter doesn't come together or your beer goes bad, that's actually a big economic problem for your family. And so the economic life has changed a little bit. And in fact, you see this in the ways that some often, like real people, are talked about. So there's a infamous witch from Northampton, Massachusetts, named Eunice Cole. She was accused several times over the course of her life. She did some really creepy stuff, but she ended up dying of old age. And when Eunice Cole dies, at the end, like she sort of lives into the 18th century, only just, if I remember correctly. And she dies living in a little like house. She's kind of out of the community. She's pushed to the edges of the community. And if you read the description of her, she's like old and scary and lives alone in a house on the edge of town on the way to the woods. How fairy tale-like is that? And so you see, and Moll Pitcher is another one. Moll Pitcher is this person. She was a real person. She sold weather charms. She actually had a position of some importance in her community. She's at a seafaring community. But by the end of her life, if you look at the John Greenleaf Whittier poem about her, she is described as an old and withered hag with a crooked nose. And that is a 19th century conception of her. Like, she didn't actually look like that.
She didn't look like that.
No, she didn't. She looked like a normal, decent-looking person. But like we see this transition in the way that real women had these reputations come to be talked about, and they're shading into the fairy tale. I have a theory too about pointy hats and brooms I can share if you want, but we might be too deep in the weeds at this point. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Thanks, Monica.
Thank you, everybody. Really good. Okay.
And thank you all for joining us at lunchtime on a rainy summer afternoon.
This is wonderful.
It was so great to see everybody.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Monica. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And books are available over here, and the authors will sign.